All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this Databases and SQL Video Tutorials course. We are hitting bonus video number 2 now, and we're going to be talking about stored procedures and functions. Now, these are a very popular subject once you get further along in your quote-unquote SQL and databases career. This is definitely an advanced topic that I don't want you to get too stressed out about if you are not yet getting into the part where you're integrating your application with your database, or rather integrating your database with your applications. Okay, so having said that, if you have hit that point and you want to learn a little bit about these things, then by all means, if you haven't yet hit that point, you're obviously more than welcome to continue on and watch this video. But just keep in mind, I don't want you to get too lost in the details because this really does apply to those once you actually get into the point where you're actually integrating these two things together. So here's what you'll learn in this lesson. You'll learn about what stored procedures are and what stored functions are all about. You're going to learn sort of the differences between the two, stored procedures versus stored functions. You're going to learn about the advantages of using these two things, stored procedures and stored functions. There's a lot of advantages, and how you're actually going to go about creating these things, obviously. And then we're going to talk about the parameters that you can sort of pass into stored procedures and the different ways that you can use these parameters. It's a little bit different from your days in programming if you have a programming background, so you'll want to pay attention to that topic as well. So what are stored procedures and stored functions? What are they all about? Well, procedures and functions are used really to perform one or more database operations within themselves all at the same time. Okay, it's not really useful to have a procedure or a function that performs just one operation. You can absolutely have those and set them up that way, but you really get the benefit when they're performing more than one operation at a time. Okay, another thing that I haven't written down here, but that is true, is with stored procedures and functions, you could start to weave in some conditional logic as well. So again, if you have a programming background, then you'll know what these conditional logics are all about. It's about throwing in loops, if statements, that kind of thing. So this is more. It's like creating an actual procedure in an application environment. Okay, if you have the programming background, you know what a procedure is all about. It's like a method. Okay, and a function is just like a method as well, except it returns something. So they're created by you, and they are stored in the database for anyone to invoke. Okay, so when you create a stored function or a stored procedure, they are actually created within the construct of the database system itself, and they are tied to the database in which they are created. So if you have multiple databases and you create a stored procedure, it will only go into the one database that you told it to go into. All of your other databases won't have access to that same stored procedure or function. Okay, and like I said, if you're familiar with methods in programming, then that's exactly what these are. They're just methods. Okay, one is sort of like a method that doesn't do anything other than, or doesn't return anything. It just does whatever you tell it to do within its construct, and functions will actually return something at the end. And they're typically used to perform commonly executed tasks for efficient code reuse. So if you have one task that you need to perform over and over on the database, and you're tired of writing it out multiple times all over the place, then you can sort of tie that all up into one stored procedure or stored function and store it in the database, and then call it from your application over and over and over. It's just like creating a method, okay, in programming, except it's stored in the database. And we'll get into why it would be beneficial to put this information, this code inside of the database as opposed to inside of your application. I'll get to that in a moment. So let's talk about the two versus each other, stored procedures versus stored functions. I've kind of already talked a little bit about this, but let's go into detail. So stored procedures are used to perform, like I said, some database operations. Typically, it's more than one is when you see the most advantage from them. But in these examples that we're going to be looking at, they're definitely going to be ones that just really only do one thing only, and that's perfectly fine. It's just, like I said, typically they tend to do a lot of stuff, okay, in the real world anyway. So, for example, these things can create data, read, modify, and delete data. So it's a standard CRUD operations. You can absolutely do those inside of stored procedures and functions. And like I said, they can also perform iterative loops. So you can have loops and conditional statements, and you can even have one procedure call another one. Okay, so you can have sort of almost like a method chaining thing going on here, so to speak, and they can do as many or as little operations as you like. Like I said, if you only want them to do one thing, then fair enough, they can just do one thing. Completely up to you how you want to make it happen. Most of the examples that we're going to do today are just going to be procedures that do one thing. Okay, perfectly fine. So stored functions in comparison to stored procedures, stored functions are just like stored procedures, except that they are made to return data. So once they are finished doing whatever it is that they need to do, they will actually return some sort of a value. Okay, for example, they can perform the same operations as above, so the same operations as a stored procedure, but they can also give us some sort of feedback about some sort of result that is that we get as a result of the operations that we just performed. And they can return any type of data. So any data type like integers or varchars or floats or what have you. Okay, they can return whatever it is that you'd like to have them return. It's just like using any old regular old select statement. If you were to select something from the database, you can do the same thing here. You're returning something from the database. So let's talk about the advantages of using these things. Okay, I call them stored routines. So the term stored routine is kind of like the blanket statement to say stored procedure and stored function. Okay, those are sort of stored routines is the parent, and stored function and procedures are kind of the children of this terminology, I guess you could say. So there are obviously many advantages to using these two things, these stored procedures and functions. Okay, first of all, they're pre-compiled, which means they're fairly fast at runtime. So when something is pre-compiled, it means that the RDBMS, the Relational Database Management System, will have already compiled these procedures, these statements, okay, or group of statements inside of these routines. It will have already compiled them sort of before you even start going and using your database, okay? So that typically means, so if you were to have a select statement or any sort of statement or operation that you were to run, if it had never been run before, then first and foremost, the RDBMS has to compile it and choose like an execution plan for it. So the RDBMS, like I said, SQL is all about, or I said this way back when, SQL is all about you tell it the what, and it figures out the how. So you tell it what it is that you want to do, and then SQL will go about it, the RDBMS will go about it and figure out what the best way to do that particular task is. And it will figure it out, and it will do it for you. So you don't have to worry about the implementation details. It's kind of like a sort of like abstracting out the details. So you just tell it what you want it to do, and it will figure out the how. Well, the same thing happens when you're compiling and choosing an execution plan. It will do that before you are actually invoking the actual procedure itself, or the routine itself, I should say. So you do save a little bit of time. It's not a massive amount of time. We're probably talking seconds or maybe less than a second. So it's really not that huge in terms of time savings, but it's definitely helpful, right? It's definitely helpful if you have it as precompiled and it has pre-decided what the execution plan should be. Okay, so it will be faster at runtime, but the real benefit in speed comes from the reduction of the number of trips back and forth from your application. So I'll go into detail about this, and this is probably one of the biggest reasons why a company would choose to use these stored routines. Okay, this is why they would choose to store operational logic, so actual conditional logic and whatnot inside of a stored routine as opposed to inside of your application. So what happens with a database is you have a whole bunch of information. You have a whole bunch of data, and this data obviously makes up the backbone of your application's functionality. So when you, let's say you're inside of your application and someone, I always use this example. Actually, let me use a better example. I was going to say when someone logs in. Let's use an example of, I don't know, let's say there's some sort of procedures that need to happen on transactions. Let's say you want to grab a bunch of transactions and determine some sort of thing from the transactions that you're grabbing. So when I mean transactions, I'm referring to the example that we talked about previously, where we have transactions in a bank. Okay, so bank transactions. So let's say we want to process these transactions, and okay, how about this? We want to have some sort of logic happen. So if the transaction is greater than $1,000, then perhaps we want to send some sort of a message to that person. Okay, maybe an alert or something. We want to say, okay, there was a transaction that's been processed for more than $1,000, and you have specified that if that were to happen, if you were to spend more than $1,000 on something, on a purchase, you've asked to be notified of that purchase. So maybe for fraud's sake, right? For fraudulent transactions. If someone were to, compromise your bank account and go on a shopping spree, you'd want to know about it. So let's say that is the specification, the requirements that we need to, put into our system to make it work in that way, shape, or form. So how do we do this? Well, typically what you would do is inside of your application code, you would put in some sort of an operation, some sort of a conditional logic that would query the table and go through each and every one of the transactions to check and see if any of them are greater than $1,000. Let's say you're checking this on a daily basis. So you check every day for only the transactions that occurred during that day. You check and see if any of them are over $1,000. Typically, what would happen would be you would run a statement that would go and get transactions one by one. So do a select statement, it would run the select statement, it would get the transaction, and then it would process it on the application side, and is it greater than 1,000 or not? If it's not, then go get the next transaction, and then it would run another select statement and get it back, and then it would run another select statement and back. And so each time you would run a single select statement on the database, that is a round trip. Okay, you're going from your applications logic, you're going then to the database, running the select statement. The select statement is getting a result set, returning it back to your application. Your application processes that result set, chooses to make some sort of deliberation based on that, chooses to do something based on that, then goes back, runs another select statement, which is another round trip to the database and back and there and back and there and back and there and back. So these trips are very, very, very costly. So this is something that happened with me in my professional career when I was dealing with a very large system. This was very typical, and it was a huge waste of time and resources in terms of CPU cycles. It would result in a massive waste of real time. We talk about 30 minutes, 45 minutes of wasted time every day in performing, these back and forth trips. And that is a massive amount of time when you're talking about, applications and the speed of computers. 45 minutes is an eternity for a computer. So we would take this logic that we found that made all these round trips, and we would take the logic and put it into the database as a stored routine. Most likely a stored procedure, but sometimes it'd be a stored function, but most of the time a stored procedure. And when we do it that way, we call the stored procedure from the application, and then the database does all the logic. We can do a select statement on the database side, and we can do all the logic that says, okay, check to see if this transaction's amount is greater than 1,000. If it is greater than 1,000, then maybe append it to some sort of a quote unquote list inside of the database, maybe append it to some variable or most likely a table. So you construct a new table in the database and store that information in the table, and then you would just return the table as a result set back to the application, and the application can then receive that table and translate it into maybe some sort of an object that you can use or make use of and process. So that way you reduce the number of trips from several hundreds to just one, and that is a massive, massive time savings. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but that's what the biggest advantage is of these stored routines. So like I said, you can use these stored routines to keep your business logic in one place. So if you put all your business logic in a database, then it's easier to test your application, and it's easier to maintain the code if it's just all in one place in the database. If you have, this particular, like if you would call this the, what's this called? The fraudulent transactions check or something like that. You can keep it in the database, and that tends to keep it in one nice neat little package, okay, as opposed to having it sprinkled all around your application code. So, and you can even add special security rules with stored routines. So you can have it so that any one given routine that uses or returns perhaps sensitive data can be managed. It can be you can add a security role level to these individual stored routines. So, like I said, if you have one particular one that touches some sensitive data, then maybe you can add a security level that's very, very high in such a way that only a handful of your employees would be able to actually execute this stored routine. Okay, that's just another added layer of an added advantage, I suppose, to using a stored routine, because you wouldn't be able to do that with just regular old select statements and whatnot. All right, cool. So that'll wrap things up for this particular part of the 4-part series, which is what this is going to be, a big one, on stored procedures and functions. So let's hit the pause button for now, and I will see you guys in the next part of these lessons. Bye for now.